Hello, everybody. This is Sam Giler in another story of Jaffa. Today's story is about an interesting grave of a day old boy of Reverend Hall, who was the head of the Protestant church in Jaffa, and one of twins that perished within few months.
All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty fascinating. We've got this historical document here, and it's all about a discovery. In the old Anglican cemetery at Jaffa in Israel.
Okay.
Um, and at the heart of it all is this guy named George Gawler.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might not recognize the name right off the bat, but he was a really early advocate for a Jewish state, like way back in the 1800s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he even wrote a whole book about it in
Oh.
1845.
Huh.
What's really cool is that this document that we're looking at today, it reveals a connection between Gawler and a grave that was discovered buried under all this sand.
Oh, that's interesting. So what can you tell me about the document itself?
So to help us break it all down and, pull out all the historical juicy bits,
Yeah.
we've got our expert here.
Well, let me jump in and tell you a bit about that document. It's actually an excerpt from a piece by Samuel Giler, who was involved in restoring the cemetery in Jaffa.
Okay, so that's where this whole fascinating discovery comes in.
Exactly.
So who was buried in this grave?
Well, it turns out it was Samuel George Gawler, one of the twin great-grandsons of, you guessed it, George Gawler.
Hold on. Twins. Okay, so now I'm really curious. How did these twins fit into George Gawler's family tree?
All right, so let's break it down. Samuel's parents were Reverend John Longley Hall and Emily Hall, whose maiden name was Gawler.
Gotcha.
She was the daughter of George Gawler's eldest daughter, Julia.
Okay, I'm following you. But you said twins. Yes. So were both of them buried in Jaffa?
Sadly, no. And this is where the story gets a little bit sad.
Mm-hmm.
Both twins actually died in infancy, most likely from something called Syrian fever, which was pretty common back then.
Oh, wow. It really makes you think about life back then.
Yeah.
Losing not just one, but both of your children at such a young age.
Absolutely. And there's another interesting detail here.
Okay.
Samuel was buried in Jaffa, but his twin brother, John Herbert Henry, he was actually buried in Jerusalem on Mount Zion, so different resting places, but connected by this really tragic event.
Wow. So we have these twins, they die tragically young, but then their mother, Emily, she channels her grief into something positive.
Mm-hmm.
She helps to establish Jaffa's first clinic.
That's right.
I mean, that's pretty powerful. How common was that kind of social activism among women back then?
It's a really good question. Women like Emily, they often played a pretty significant role in community development, especially when it came to things like healthcare and education.
Right.
And you have to remember, back then there weren't the same kind of formal social services that we have today, so individuals really had to step up and fill those gaps.
That makes a lot of sense. So tell me, what about Reverend Hall? What was his role in all of this?
Well, he was a pretty key figure. You see, he was head of the Christian Missionary Society in Jaffa.
Oh, wow.
He got there in 1876 and stayed until 1884. Before eventually moving on to Jerusalem to continue his work.
That's amazing. I mean, imagine living in Jaffa back then. It must have been a totally different world. Can you kind of paint us a picture of what it was like back then?
Yeah, sure. So picture this. You're in the old walled city. That's where Reverend Hall lived. And get this, his house is still standing.
What?
Yeah, and it's now being used as a local theater. It's amazing to think about all the history those walls have seen.
It's incredible, isn't it? It makes you wonder what kind of traces of our own family history are still out there, just waiting to be discovered.
It really does. And speaking of traces, we can't forget about the English hospital in Jaffa, which was also built around the same time.
Oh, right?
That's still standing too, although under different ownership now.
Wow. It's amazing how these places, these buildings, they've just witnessed so much history. It's a real tangible connection to the past, isn't it?
It really is.
All right, so let's shift gears a bit and talk more about George Gawler's vision for a Jewish state. What were some of his big ideas? And how did they end up influencing later movements?
Well, it's important to remember he wasn't just talking about a Jewish state in some abstract way. He was putting forward very specific solutions to the problems that Jewish communities were facing, both in Europe and under Ottoman rule.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And he really believed that establishing agricultural settlements in Palestine, that was the way forward, a way to create self-sufficiency and a better life for Jewish people.
So it'd be fair to say we're seeing the roots of modern-day Israel in his ideas?
I'd say absolutely. And he wasn't just paying lip service to this vision, he was deeply committed. He even went with Sir Moses Montefiore on a tour of Palestine in 1849 to try and make it happen.
Wow.
This was at a time when the idea of a Jewish state was still very much a dream, and he was out there doing the groundwork.
It's amazing to think about. We started with this mysterious grave in Jaffa, and now we've uncovered this whole family connection to a visionary like George Gawler. I mean, who would have thought?
It really is quite something, and it just goes to show you the beauty of history, doesn't it?
Yeah.
These little details can unlock these incredible stories and shed light on the lives of people who came before us.
Thanks for listening and join us again.